Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining me on the Slice of Technology podcast. I'm your host, Jared Taylor. Joining me today is Brian Goffman, the VP at McKinsey, leading the generative AI and software practice. Brian, how's it going?
Going well, thanks. Great to be here.
Great to have you. We're going to dive right into some juicy topics. So right out of the gate, I want to get your thoughts on personal perspectives around AI and society. Where you see generative AI influencing society at large. And then from there, we'll kind of go a little bit deeper. But let's start off with that and then kick this thing off.
Sounds great. And let me just say, my background is, currently at McKinsey, I help lead the software and Gen AI practice and work with a lot of clients to help them particularly improve their productivity with engineering and product management. But my history in the tech industry goes back to earlier days of the internet. I've also been at LinkedIn and was at Smart Things doing smart home work, and started a company in marketing automation, which was acquired by Marketo and now is Adobe. So I've had different hats in the industry, and some of that I think applies here. So to your question, on the overall view, one of the things I think, if you go back to the 90s, the early days of the internet, a lot of people would say things like they say now about AI, like, oh, it's okay. I see a website, but it doesn't do this and it doesn't do that. And the video is only really small, or there's no video at all. And if anything, it was a failure of imagination to think about what happened in 20 years, where you have companies worth trillions of dollars. And some of them are really older companies like Microsoft and Apple that took advantage of the internet and are now bigger than anyone could have even imagined. So I think my personal goal is to not have a failure of imagination this time, seeing these things and they don't work, or they're broken, or this is wrong. But it's still early days, in my opinion. I mean, inning 2 at most. And this may be a game that just goes on forever. It may not even have a 9th inning.
It's kind of interesting. Sorry, I just wanted to add, it's kind of interesting what we're seeing here, right? Because there's more than this, but there's essentially 2 buckets. There's the companies that are deploying AI, and it actually makes total sense for their use case, and they're thinking ahead. And then there's probably what haunts a lot of VCs' inboxes, the pitch decks where everyone just kind of slapped AI on the pitch deck, and maybe it wasn't the best the best use case for it, right? You probably see this a lot. I'll let you go back, but I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and I've been a VC, and I do a lot. I'm an active angel investor as well. I think that's no different from slapping .com on your name, or slapping, a Bitcoin thing when Bitcoin was, in its frenzy. I don't think people are fooled now about having .ai on your domain name. But I do think there are native AI companies which are different from non-native, and it'll be similar to companies that were, say, native cloud companies that are versus slightly before. Like my startup, we started before the cloud was really a viable path to build on, but we did have a hosted data server in a data center. So we didn't own the server, we didn't own the data center, but we still had to have our own server that we maintained. You'd never do that 2 years later. So I think if you're starting a company now in AI, you're going to be different than if you're slapping AI onto your domain or onto your products and trying to iterate from where you are.
One of the things I wanted to, from the first question that we talked about, as I wanted to get your thoughts on the overall impact of AI on both the global economy and then more specifically the impact on developer productivity.
Sure. So McKinsey has done a lot of work going back to really, early days of post-ChatGPT launch, looking at the impact on the global economy. Now, there was work before that on AI and the global economy, but I don't think it was quite as extrapolated and in depth. And you have to take it not with a grain of salt, but certainly with a lot of range of confidence intervals, because the way the methodology works is you look at all these use cases and say, well, if we could save 5% of this and 10% of that, and then you extrapolate that out across the entire world, you get to some just massive numbers in the trillions of dollars. And so a lot of that's where you've seen, $4 trillion, $5 trillion impact of AI in the next, 5 years. And it's taking a realistic time frame on a realistic set of scenarios and then extrapolating that out on the overall economy. So I think there's a big range of those. But the thing that is definitely true is then when you drill in on which functions in business are going to have the most impact, which functions or which industries are going to have the most impact, what you see is a more clear answer even today. So you've got software development is probably the highest impact, and also not necessarily a big part of the global workforce, but a huge part of the productivity of the workforce. And so that's going to have a massive impact all over the world. And the second thing is sales and marketing, customer support, the stuff that you hear about now, case studies getting built out and real ROI. Beyond that, there's lots of other things. There's supply chain analytics. There's basically any function within a business, you could say, oh, this will be better with AI. But it's a little smaller and a little slower. And then when you take an industry view, it's very similar to the adoption of technology in almost every wave. It's just happening a lot faster and around the world. So tech is the first industry to adopt. They're always the first. And then you go to banking and finance, and then, which is in many cases, those companies are essentially software development houses. They just trade money instead of, selling software. And then you kind of go beyond and beyond that. And eventually you land in like oil and gas and other places where you have huge employment bases, but not necessarily really fast adoption of technology. So my thesis is this is very similar to cloud. It's very similar to mobile. It's very similar to even the internet, when it became commercial, but it's happening just a lot faster and a lot more globally and across more industries. So it's a compressed impact in a few years instead of decades, which is maybe what happened with other technology waves.
One of the things I hear, Brian, is around the challenges. Some of this because of how fast everything's moving, right? But not just because of that, but it's the AI integration challenges. So you have all these organizations that don't want to be left behind. So these enterprises are adopting generative AI, some for legit reasons, some for, like we said, the slapping the name up. But some of them are facing significant challenges. So in your experience, what are some of the most underestimated hurdles in the AI integration, and how can companies be better prepared for those hurdles?
Well, let me start with what are some, look, every week, at least once a week, I see something and I go, wow, didn't know I could do that. If you're using the tools and you try new things, at least I get blown away, at least once a week, sometimes more. So the demos are unbelievable, right? But then you say, oh God, how do I use this every day? And I think this is one of those technologies where the first use case, the first time you use it, you're amazed, but then you don't get that same, I want to do this every day kind of addiction that social media has, and we struggle with this, if I go back to LinkedIn, we struggle with this a bit because LinkedIn originally was a place you went to when you wanted to change jobs. And over time, we built more and more features that made you come back. And now it's a, staple of networking, and people think of it for that, not necessarily for looking for a job. So I think AI is going through a little bit of that as well on the consumer side, where, do you really, and the way that's going to happen, in my opinion, is it just gets built into more things that you're doing every day. And Apple's going to do this when it's part of your iPhone, and then you just naturally do something, and now you've got an AI feature. And then, if you have a complicated problem, you go to ChatGPT to solve it. So on the consumer side, I think it's kind of on a path, but it's not there yet to regular use and overcoming the barrier of pilot equivalent for a consumer where maybe you paid for a month, but then you churn. On the enterprise side, the challenges are really different. I mean, depending on the type of enterprise, they have legacy IT. They're not necessarily even in the cloud. They don't have a data strategy. They don't know what the legal risks are. Like, they have a laundry list, really long, when you go from, we have this really cool demo and we can do all these things 10% faster or 50% faster, or maybe, 5 times faster, to we need to scale this out and we want to put it online and, let people really use it at scale. And one by one, those things are getting knocked down. The legal risks, for example, Adobe has solved a lot of the risks of using, IP from them by training their model only on their own content. But if you go to a lot of other solutions, those could be used for ideation, but images can't be used for production because nobody knows if they're going to get sued later because they don't own the IP. So there's a lot of issues like that in the startup world, people don't necessarily talk about and don't think about because they're not worried about that. But if you're in a bigger company or a large agency, for example, you are worried about that. On the Microsoft's doing similar things with code, with IP indemnification. When it comes to the data issue, that's creating actually a lot of potential work for consultants and for other companies like Databricks that are now helping you organize all your data. And when you make your data organized and you put it in the right format, and there's a lot of infrastructure getting built out for that, now you can train your model and you can use your data in production. So I think it's just a matter of time. And a lot of the investors, the VCs, they've been kind of frustrated or surprised that they could build something. They got tons of pilots, lots of interest, even paid pilots. And then people go, oh, wait a minute. We have all these other things we got to knock down before we can sign that, full production license and pay you millions of dollars.
Yeah, it seems like everyone's willing to sign up for that free trial or just out of pure curiosity, right? They want to see what all the hype is about. I'm sure it's a challenge from there to get people to convert to these paid users from there, not just on the consumer side, right, but on the enterprise as well.
Yeah, on the consumer side, it's a paid trial or free trial. On the enterprise side, it's essentially the same thing. It's just happening in a like a higher dollar value. But I think the pressure is coming from the board of directors. It's coming from the CEO. It's coming from the expectation that we're all going to see a massive productivity improvement from all these investments that are being made. And I do believe in it. I just think the ROI is going to be there. It's just happening slower. It's happening at like fast enterprise speed, but not startup speed. So what some of the startups are doing is they're actually going and selling to other startups, or they're selling to mid-market companies that have their data in place or are in the cloud native, or, but they're not necessarily the biggest logos, but they're getting production out of that. So that's one way to address this issue. But I think it's from a McKinsey perspective, it's created a lot of opportunity to help companies sort all this out. And a lot of times they'll come in and say, we've let 1,000 flowers bloom. We have all these pilots happening. Everybody wants money. Now we want to go to production. How do we stack rank this? What is the ROI of these different projects? And that's why they're bringing in outside help to help them, just like they do with other types of projects, to figure out, what's the highest priority and how do they go implement these things at scale.
At McKinsey, what are some of these enterprise Gen AI solutions that are on your radar or that you're very high on?
Well, I'll start with where I mentioned earlier on developer productivity. So there's been enough experience now that if you release a tool to a bunch of developers, and I'm talking about companies that have, say, 10,000, 5,000 plus developers, you're going to get pretty spotty adoption. Part of it is the mindset. Some developers say, look, I know what I'm doing. I don't need this Copilot. I'm doing fine without it. Some worry about their job getting replaced over time. Maybe it's, or get offshored or outsourced. There's a lot of things in mindset that have to be overcome. The other is just with every tool, there's a certain amount of training and just adoption. And also the tools are getting better and better, but maybe the first time you used it a year ago, it sucked. So you gave up and you don't want to try it again. But that's the experience of a lot of companies where they went all in, they gave it to everybody, but they're seeing, 50% adoption, or they're not seeing at scale the kind of crazy percentage improvement in productivity that they did when they did a small scale test. And at McKinsey, we actually ran experiments with developers. We've also done it with product managers using different tools. And you do see 20 to 50% improvement in speed with basically no quality decrease. Quality stays about the same, but the velocity improves dramatically. But you don't see that when you deploy it to 10,000 developers. You see maybe 10% or 15, which is still unbelievable. But that's not the same as a small scale. So now people are trying to bridge that gap. And so what that requires is some change management, mindset change, some training in the tool, and then also a change in the way people work. And I think that's the thing that hasn't happened yet in the developer lifecycle or product lifecycle. It's people are talking about this already, but the role of the product manager. Well, if you're a product manager, now you can do design because you can draw it on a napkin and turn it into a JavaScript, code, and then deploy it potentially. If you're a developer, you can do design, or if you're a product manager, you can do some coding. So like the roles are getting a little murky because of the tools. So nobody really knows how the roles and handoffs are going to quite happen, except that they're changing and people are getting expected to do more within their, and not necessarily just stay in the same lane they were in before. So that's one kind of longer term impact, which hasn't happened yet, but it's clear it's going to change productivity. It's going to make people a lot more, hopefully, productive and happier with their jobs because they don't have to wait for the next part of this the train to move before they can go.
This actually really ties in well with what I wanted to ask you next, Brian, was really around the talent gap in AI. So obviously there's a clear demand for these skilled professionals in AI. But one of the things that I would love to hear from you is what strategies do you recommend for companies to be able to attract and retain top AI talent, especially it's such a competitive field?
Yeah, so there are companies that are doing a wholesale revamp of their talent strategy or trying to look at how their mix of talent is set up with AI as a ingredient. At the extreme, and I won't mention the company, but there are companies that have done layoffs of even 10% or 20% of their workforce, and then said we're going to rehire the same number of people we just laid off with a focus on AI. Like in that case, they've made the decision. They ran the pilot. They said, we know, these type of developers, these type of roles, these kind of roles make sense. These ones we don't think we need anymore. And they're rehiring now. So the total employment's staying the same or growing, but it's changing the mix. And that's I'm seeing the first kind of dislocations like that are happening in Silicon Valley. It hasn't really happened in a bank, but it probably will. It's just a matter of time. And it's also going to, because it is a zero-sum game to some extent. You can't just keep hiring. So you do have to look at what you're investing in. Now, in the case of, say, the government, where they can't necessarily do a layoff, they have to retrain. And I think that's what a lot of forward-thinking companies will do as well, depending on their culture. And that's going to require a training program, investment in retooling people, and giving them time to shift over. And so a lot of companies, and certainly the government and national governments, are starting to do that because they're concerned about this kind of dislocation. But as far as getting people, I think it is getting easier, partly because a lot of people are going back to school and retraining themselves. The demand for programs, podcasts like this, just like learning everything is very high. And so people are going where the jobs are as well. And I think they're doing it on their own. That may not fill the gap, but there's a lot of sources of renewal that people can use on their own. And I think just like a lot of other fields, there's going to be a short-term need, but then it'll get filled. Now, I do think at the very high end, like if you need somebody who's got a Stanford PhD in AI, that's a very small set of people. And you're competing with DeepMind and everyone else who's got OpenAI and like the can pay, even hedge funds, that can pay a lot of money for that talent and offer them a lot of perks. So I don't think very many companies can get those people, and I also don't think very many companies need those people. But in the broader scheme of developers and product managers who know AI, marketers who know AI, salespeople who know AI, I think the world is retraining itself.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well said. I think going back to your banking point, I think that'll be one of the biggest industries impacted that we will see at some point layoffs. They're just slower to react to it all, right? And they also have some kind of more moving parts they need to take care of before they end up doing that. Before we wrap up here, Brian, one last quick question for you. What are you most looking forward to from the Human X event?
I think it's just an incredible opportunity with the group that you've gotten together to share ideas. Things are changing so fast. I talked about that kind of aha moment every week. I like to hear from other people what they're seeing. And, it's a time when you got to be judicious about how you spend your time because there's so much opportunity. But I do think this is one of those opportunities to get together with an incredible group of people and hear from them what they're experiencing, what they're seeing. And I just think that's going to be the main benefit for me.
Love it. Yeah, I'm excited. Look forward to seeing you there. It'll be a great event. I can't believe it's in March, but it's already almost like we're almost in September now. So it's crazy how quickly it'll be here.
Time flies.
Well,
it does.
Brian, thank you so much for joining us here today. Look forward to future conversations.
Fantastic. Thanks for the time.